When I collapsed on stage during my graduation, the hospital called my emergency contact. My mother answered, told the doctor I was just being dramatic, and hung up. While I was hooked up to heart monitors, my sister posted a picture of our family sipping cocktails on a Miami yacht. 2 days later, my mother finally texted me not to ask if I was alive, but to demand my social security number to bail out her golden child. My name is Vanessa, 33 years old, and I spent my entire life trying to earn a place in a family that only saw me as an ATM. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace. Trust me, you will want to hear how I turned their financial fraud into a federal trap. The harsh fluorescent lights of the Chicago Medical Center forced my eyes open. A steady, rhythmic beeping echoed in my ears, slowly cutting through the thick fog in my brain. I tried to sit up, but a sharp ache shot through my arm. I looked down, seeing an IV needle taped to my skin. My mouth felt like dry cotton. The last thing I remembered was standing on a brightly lit stage wearing my graduation gown, reaching out to accept my diploma for my master's degree in forensic accounting. Then the floor rushed up to meet me, and everything went black. The heavy door to my room pushed open, and a doctor in a crisp white coat stepped inside. He offered a tight, sympathetic smile as he checked the monitors above my bed. He introduced himself as Dr. Evans, explaining I had suffered from severe exhaustion and dehydration. He told me my blood pressure had dropped dangerously low. I asked him if my family was outside in the waiting room. I knew they had skipped my ceremony, but surely the hospital had called them when I was loaded into the ambulance. Dr. Evans paused, his expression shifting to one of deep discomfort. He looked down at his tablet before speaking. He told me they had indeed called my primary emergency contact, my mother, Patricia. The doctor explained that when he informed her I was in the emergency room, she sighed loudly into the phone. She claimed I was pulling stunts for attention and was busy packing for a flight. Then she hung up on him. He tried calling back, but it went straight to voicemail. A heavy silence filled the small room. The steady beep of the heart monitor seemed to mock me. I was 33 years old, a grown woman who had just earned an advanced degree in investigating complex financial crimes, yet I was still waiting for a mother who never cared. I had worked 80-hour weeks while taking night classes to pay for this degree out of my own pocket. I did it all without asking them for a dime. And still they could not even be bothered to answer a phone call. I swallowed hard, forcing tears back down my throat. Crying over Patricia was a waste of hydration. I thanked the doctor for his honesty. He nodded softly and left me alone with my thoughts. I reached for my bag on the bedside table and pulled out my phone. There were no missed calls from my mother. There were no text messages from my sister Brittany. There were only promotional emails and a calendar reminder that I missed my own graduation dinner. Just as the isolation began to crush my chest, the door clicked open again. I braced myself for a nurse, but instead, I saw a familiar, frail figure rushing into the room. It was my grandmother Beatrice. At 78 years old, she leaned heavily on her silver walking cane. She was wearing her Sunday coat, the one she only brought out for special occasions. She had taken a 2-hour bus ride across Chicago by herself the moment the university called her as my secondary emergency contact. Beatrice dropped her small purse on the floor, hurried to my bedside, and wrapped her wrinkled hands around mine. Her eyes were red from crying. She kissed my forehead, her voice trembling as she told me how terrified she felt. She did not ask where my mother was. She did not need to. My grandmother had spent her entire life trying to compensate for the love my mother refused to give me. As she stroked my hair, I made a silent promise to myself. Beatrice was my real family. I would never let my mother or sister use my success to fund their toxic lives again. Beatrice settled into the uncomfortable plastic hospital chair beside my bed, humming a soft hymn to calm my racing heart. I leaned back against the stiff pillows and unlocked my phone, needing a distraction from the dull ache of the IV needle in my arm. I opened Instagram. The very first post on my feed was from Brittany. The location tag read, Miami Beach, Florida. The photo showed my sister wearing a designer swimsuit lounging on the deck of a sleek white yacht. Beside her stood Jamal holding a bottle of expensive champagne. He wore oversized designer sunglasses and a thick gold chain that caught the glaring Florida sun. My mother Patricia was in the background laughing with a cocktail in her hand. The caption read, "Celebrating Jamal securing his new angel investors. So blessed to have a husband who provides. Finally a family trip to Miami Beach. No stress, no drama. Just winning." I stared at the screen, my blood turning to ice. The timestamp showed the photo was posted exactly 2 hours ago, right around the time the emergency room doctor was desperately trying to reach my mother. They were not busy packing for a flight to come see me. They were already in Miami popping champagne on a rented yacht, completely ignoring the fact that I had collapsed on stage. The phrase "no drama" felt like a direct stab at me. To Patricia and Brittany, my hospitalization was not a medical emergency. It was just inconvenient drama threatening to ruin their luxurious celebration. If you have ever caught a toxic relative lying on social media while you were suffering in real life, hit the like button right now and tell me your story in the comments. You know exactly how sickening that realization feels. As I was staring at the photo, a notification banner dropped down from the top of my screen. It was a text message from Patricia. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened it. There was no greeting, no question asking how I was feeling, no concern for whether I was even conscious. The message was cold, transactional, and infuriatingly entitled. It read, "We need you. Answer now. Jamal has a massive opportunity for his startup, and we need your social security number and signature to act as a guarantor for a business loan. Your credit score is perfect, and you owe this family after ruining the mood today. Send your details immediately." I read the message 3 times, making sure the painkillers were not causing me to hallucinate. She wanted me to guarantee a loan for Jamal. Jamal, a man who had never held a steady job for more than 6 months, was suddenly securing angel investors and needing federal business loans. This was a man who drove a leased luxury SUV, while his wife, my sister, constantly complained about maxed-out credit cards at every holiday dinner. He had spent the last 5 years bouncing from one failed get-rich-quick scheme to another, and now he was supposedly running a tech startup. The analytical side of my brain, the part that had just earned a master's degree in forensic accounting, immediately began flashing warning signs. People with legitimate angel investors do not need their hospitalized sister-in-law to co-sign a loan. They definitely do not demand social security numbers over a text message while vacationing on a yacht. I looked at Beatrice, who had fallen asleep in the chair, her frail chest rising and falling softly. Patricia was willing to risk my financial future without a single thought. I typed a single word in response to Patricia. No. I hit send and tossed the phone onto the bedside table. Less than 10 seconds later, my phone began to vibrate. The screen lit up with an incoming call from Patricia. I let it ring. It rang again and again. Finally, another text came through. "Stop being selfish, Vanessa. Jamal is about to secure a $300,000 federal SBA loan. The bank just needs a cosigner with pristine credit. You sit in an office all day looking at spreadsheets. You do not need your credit score right now. We are family. You do this for family." I scoffed quietly. The audacity was breathtaking. They had abandoned me on my graduation day, ignored a hospital emergency call, and were now demanding I legally bind myself to a massive debt so Jamal could play pretend CEO in Miami. My perfect credit score was the result of years of meticulous financial planning, living in a tiny apartment, and working grueling hours. It was my safety net, and Patricia wanted to hand it over to a grifter. The pieces did not fit. An SBA loan requires rigorous documentation and proof of revenue. If Jamal had angel investors funding yacht trips, he would not qualify for a government-backed loan meant for struggling small businesses. Someone was lying. The money funding their Miami trip was not from legitimate investors. It was either illicit or they were burning through cash they did not actually have, desperately trying to secure a new loan to cover their tracks. I was a certified expert in financial fraud. If Jamal was playing games with federal loans, there would be a paper trail, and I was going to find it. Before I could even open my laptop browser, the phone in my hand started ringing once again. The caller ID flashed my mother's name. I let it ring twice, taking a deep breath to steady my pulse. To build a strong case against them, I needed them to talk. I pressed accept and brought the phone to my ear, remaining silent. "Vanessa, what is wrong with you?" Patricia snapped. Her voice was sharp and loud, echoing slightly against the hospital room walls. No hello, no asking if I was okay, no questioning what the doctor had said about my collapse, just immediate stinging irritation. I responded with a calm, flat tone, asking her why she was calling me from a yacht while I was hooked up to an IV drip. "Do not start with the dramatic victim act," Patricia huffed. I heard the clinking of a glass in the background. "You were just dehydrated. The doctor said you just needed some fluids. You are fine. We are dealing with a time-sensitive business emergency, and you are being incredibly selfish by sending me a one-word text message. Jamal is on the verge of a major breakthrough, and you are trying to sabotage him out of sheer jealousy." I adjusted my posture against the stiff hospital pillows, ignoring the throbbing in my arm. I asked her to explain to me exactly what this so-called emergency was. Patricia lowered her voice, taking on that condescending tone she always used. "Jamal has a tech startup, Vanessa, an innovative logistics platform. It is ready to scale globally. He has massive angel investors lined up, but they want to see that he has secured traditional banking support first. He needs a $300,000 small business administration loan to finalize the next phase of development." I actually laughed out loud. The sound startled my grandmother, who shifted in her sleep but did not wake. I asked my mother if she even knew what an SBA loan was. I reminded her that federal business loans are not handed out to people who lease Range Rovers while carrying zero actual business revenue. If Jamal had real angel investors, they would be injecting equity capital, not demanding he go into debt with the federal government. Patricia cut me off, her voice rising in pitch. "You always think you are the smartest person in the room, just because you stare at spreadsheets all day. You do not understand how high-level entrepreneurs operate. The underwriter at the bank said Jamal's debt-to-income ratio is slightly off because he has been reinvesting all his personal money into the company. All they need is a guarantor with a pristine credit score to co-sign the application. It is just a formality." A formality, I repeated, feeling my blood pressure spike. Co-signing a $300,000 federal loan is not a formality. It makes me legally responsible for the debt when Jamal inevitably defaults. If he misses a payment, my credit is destroyed. If he goes bankrupt, the government comes after my assets. "He is not going to default," Patricia screamed through the receiver. "He is your brother-in-law. He is family. This is what families do for each other. You have an 820 credit score, and you sit in a cheap apartment doing absolutely nothing with it. Brittany is trying to build a legacy, and you are hoarding your credit like a greedy miser." I gripped my hospital phone so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white under the harsh fluorescent lights of the room. My pristine credit score was my ticket to buying my own home and securing my future. I built it by eating ramen noodles for 3 years while paying off my student loans ahead of schedule. I worked grueling double shifts during tax season to make sure I never missed a single payment. Meanwhile, Brittany and Jamal were buying designer clothes on high-interest credit cards. I told Patricia in the clearest voice I could muster that I would rather set my Social Security card on fire than attach it to Jamal's fraudulent lifestyle. I told her that his tech startup was a ghost company, and I would not be his financial human shield. The phone line went completely dead and silent for a long moment. I could hear the ocean breeze brushing against her microphone. When Patricia finally spoke again, the entitled whine in her voice was completely gone. It was replaced by a cold, venomous tone that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. She quickly realized she could not manipulate me with simple guilt trips anymore, so she prepared to use her absolute most ruthless emotional weapon against me instead. "If you think you can just say no and walk away from this family, you are sorely mistaken," Patricia hissed. Her voice was no longer frantic, it was deliberate and cruel. "Jamal needs that $300,000 loan cleared by Friday. If you refuse to be the guarantor, I will have no choice but to find the capital somewhere else. And since your sister is tapped out, I will be pulling the funds directly from your grandmother's retirement accounts." My breath caught in my throat. I turned my head to look at Beatrice. She was still dozing in the chair next to my hospital bed, her breathing fragile and shallow. She had worked her entire life as a public school cafeteria manager, scraping together a modest retirement fund so she would never be a burden to anyone in her old age. I asked Patricia if she was out of her mind. I reminded her that Beatrice's retirement fund was meant to cover her in-home care, her prescription medications, and her daily living expenses. Patricia let out a dry, heartless chuckle. "I am her daughter, Vanessa. I am on all of her banking accounts as a joint holder in case of emergencies." "This is an emergency. If you do not sign that loan application and let Jamal secure this funding, I will drain every single penny Beatrice has saved. She will be completely broke, and I will put her in the cheapest state-run nursing home I can find. It is entirely up to you. You can either use your precious credit score, or you can watch your grandmother lose everything she has ever worked for." The sheer evil of her ultimatum hung in the sterile hospital air. She was holding an elderly woman hostage to fund Jamal's delusions of grandeur. This was the woman who gave birth to me, casually threatening to destroy her own mother's life, just to keep up appearances on a rented yacht in Miami. My shock quickly transformed into a cold, calculated rage. I did not yell. I did not cry. I leaned closely into the microphone of my phone. I told Patricia that if she touched a single cent of Beatrice's money, I would personally see to it that she spent the rest of her life wearing a federal prison jumpsuit that matched her ugly personality. I told her the conversation was over. Before she could scream another threat, I pressed the red button and ended the call. I immediately blocked her number. I blocked Brittany's number. I blocked Jamal's number. I let out a long exhale, feeling the adrenaline pumping through my veins, temporarily overriding the exhaustion that had put me in this hospital bed in the first place. I looked over at Beatrice. She stirred slightly, opening her eyes and offering me a warm, sleepy smile. I smiled back, promising her silently that nobody was going to touch her savings or her dignity. I reached over to my canvas work tote sitting on the floor beside the bed. My arm throbbed as the IV line pulled taut, but I ignored the pain. I pulled out my heavy silver laptop and flipped it open, balancing it on my knees over the thin hospital blanket. I connected to the secure hospital network and activated my encrypted virtual private network. As a certified forensic accountant, I do not just look at spreadsheets. I dissect them. I track missing money, expose shell companies, and build airtight cases against corporate fraudsters for a living. Jamal thought he was dealing with a naive, subservient little sister. He forgot he was dealing with a federal auditor who knew exactly how to follow the money. I opened my browser and logged directly into the proprietary financial databases I used for my agency work. I bypassed the public search engines and went straight into the state business registry, pulling up the corporate records for the state of Illinois. I typed in the exact name of Jamal's so-called tech startup, Apex Logistics Solutions. My fingers flew across the keyboard, the rhythmic clacking filling the quiet room. I pulled the employer identification number for the business. I cross-referenced the corporate registration with federal tax databases. If Jamal was telling the truth about having major angel investors, there would be a solid paper trail. There would be filings with the Securities and Exchange Commission. There would be registered intellectual property payroll taxes for his supposed team of developers and commercial lease agreements. Instead, the deeper I dug, the more the illusion began to unravel before my eyes. The corporate address registered to Apex Logistics Solutions was not a high-rise office building in downtown Chicago. It was a post office box in a rundown strip mall in the suburbs. There were no employees. There was no payroll. There was absolutely nothing resembling a legitimate technology enterprise. I downloaded the publicly available state tax filings and leaned closer to the screen, my eyes scanning the dismal numbers. Jamal was not a CEO. He was running a ghost ship, and I was about to sink it. I pulled up the Uniform Commercial Code filings for the state of Illinois. If a business takes on secured debt, the lender files a lien against the company assets. It is public record if you know where to look. I expected to see maybe one or two standard business lines of credit. Instead, my screen populated with a cascading list of aggressive, high-interest merchant cash advances. Jamal had taken out 6 different loans from predatory lenders in the span of just 8 months. These were not traditional banks. These were the kinds of aggressive lenders who charged 40% interest and required daily automatic withdrawals directly from the business checking account. I opened a second window on my monitor and pulled up Brittany's public Instagram feed, placing it side by side with the state financial records. The timeline was a perfect, damning map of financial fraud. On April 12th, Jamal secured a $40,000 short-term business loan. On April 15th, Brittany posted a glowing photo of a brand new white Range Rover with a giant red bow on the hood, captioning it about her husband's amazing business success. On July 2nd, another lender dumped $25,000 into the Apex Logistics account. On July 4th, Jamal was suddenly flashing a solid gold Rolex Submariner at a luxury steakhouse. They were not building a company. They were running a shell game, funneling toxic high-interest corporate debt directly into personal luxury items to fabricate an illusion of extreme wealth. Jamal was treating these predatory business loans like a personal slush fund. He was piercing the corporate veil, destroying any legal protection his company might have offered him. But the most crucial detail was hidden in the default notices. As a licensed auditor, I have access to a federal database that flags delinquent corporate accounts. I ran Jamal's corporate identification number through the system. A bright red warning banner flashed across my screen. Apex Logistics Solutions was currently in active default on 3 separate loans. The daily automatic withdrawals from his bank account had started bouncing 2 weeks ago. My eyes scanned the hard data, the reality of their situation snapping into sharp focus. There were no angel investors in Miami. The yacht, the champagne, the designer swimsuits, it was all a desperate maxed-out facade. They were entirely out of money. The predatory lenders were circling, preparing to freeze Jamal's accounts and repossess the Range Rover. Jamal's personal credit was undoubtedly destroyed, which is exactly why he could not secure a traditional bank loan himself. That was the real reason they were demanding my Social Security number. The $300,000 Small Business Administration loan was not for scaling a global tech platform. It was a federal bailout. Jamal was planning to use government-backed funds to pay off his loan sharks and keep his fake millionaire lifestyle afloat. And because my name and pristine credit score would be on the guarantor line, I would be the one the federal government came after when he inevitably blew through that money too. They were trying to throw me in front of a financial freight train so they could keep sipping cocktails. I had spent 33 years trying to prove my worth to a family that viewed me as nothing more than a disposable asset. I closed the database, a chilling realization washing over me. Patricia knew. My mother might not understand the intricate details of merchant cash advances, but she knew Jamal was completely out of money. That was why she was so quick to threaten my grandmother's retirement fund. They were backed into a corner, drowning in debt and completely desperate. And desperate people are incredibly dangerous. I leaned back against the hospital bed, the rhythmic beep of my heart monitor steady and calm. I was no longer the exhausted, rejected daughter seeking her mother's approval. I was an investigator who had just caught a thief red-handed. I knew I had to act quickly. If Patricia was willing to liquidate a 78-year-old woman's life savings to save her golden child, there was no limit to what she would do next. I carefully logged out of the federal portals and cleared my browser history. I needed to get out of this hospital and secure my personal documents before they returned to Chicago. Jamal and Brittany were entirely broke, and I was their only lifeline. The conflict was no longer just about family drama. It was about survival. They were completely desperate, and I knew they would be coming for me the second I was discharged. 2 days passed. I was back in my small one-bedroom apartment in Logan Square, still nursing a bruised arm from the IV line, but my mind was sharper than ever. I had spent 48 hours building a defensive fortress around my credit profile, placing fraud alerts on my Social Security number with all 3 major credit bureaus. I knew they were coming. I just did not expect them to be so brazen. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the aggressive pounding on my front door rattled the hinges. I did not even have time to look through the peephole before the door pushed open. My landlord had recently replaced the locks and the latch had not fully caught. Patricia marched into my living room like she owned the building, her designer heels clicking sharply against my hardwood floor. Right behind her was my sister Brittany, clutching a pristine white Prada handbag that I now knew was funded by a 40% interest loan shark. And bringing up the rear, ducking his head under my doorframe, was Jamal. He was wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit that screamed new money. The fabric was beautiful, but the fit was slightly off. It was the unmistakable look of a man who bought something wildly expensive just to prove to the world that he could afford it even when his bank accounts were bleeding dry. Jamal looked around my modest apartment, his lip curling into a sneer of pure disgust. He adjusted his silk tie and let out a loud, mocking laugh. "So, this is where the big-shot accountant lives," he said, his voice booming in my small space. "I thought people with perfect credit scores could afford more than 500 square feet of cheap drywall. You live like a broke college student, Vanessa. It is actually embarrassing." Brittany chimed in right on cue, wrinkling her nose as she looked at my secondhand sofa. She told me the apartment smelled like cheap coffee and depression, insisting I needed to let Jamal help me upgrade my lifestyle once he secured his funding. I stood my ground behind my kitchen island, my arms crossed tightly over my chest. I asked them to leave immediately, reminding them that forcing their way into my home was trespassing. Patricia ignored me completely. She slammed a thick stack of papers onto my granite counter. The documents were branded with the logo of a major commercial bank. It was the guarantor application for the $300,000 Small Business Administration loan. She slammed a heavy gold pen on top of the stack and demanded I sign the highlighted pages right that very second. Jamal stepped forward, closing the distance between us until he was standing just inches away from me on the other side of the island. He then walked around the counter, invading my personal space. He was a large man, towering over my 5'4" frame, and he clearly thought his sheer physical presence would be enough to break my resolve. He leaned down, his expensive cologne suffocating the air between us. "Listen to me very carefully, little sister," Jamal growled, his friendly facade completely vanishing into a look of raw malice. "I am running a multi-million-dollar enterprise. I have investors waiting on my every word. I do not have time to play these petty family games with you. You are going to sign this paper right now, or I am going to make sure your life becomes a living nightmare." I looked straight up into his eyes, refusing to take a single step backward or break eye contact. The sheer arrogance of a man who was actively defaulting on predatory loans, trying to intimidate me in my own home, was almost laughable. I told him he was standing in an apartment I paid for with my own hard-earned money, not with funds stolen from high-interest merchant cash advances. I saw the muscles in his jaw twitch the exact second I mentioned the cash advances. A flash of genuine panic crossed his face. His eyes darted nervously toward Brittany and Patricia, who clearly had no idea what specific financial terminology I was talking about. Patricia slammed her hand against the counter again, trying to regain control of the room. She yelled at me to stop making up ridiculous excuses and pick up the pen. Her face was flushed with anger as she reiterated her disgusting threat from the hospital. She screamed that if I did not sign the document within the next 30 seconds, she was driving straight to Beatrice's bank to liquidate my grandmother's retirement accounts. The air in the room grew suffocatingly tight. Jamal pressed closer, tapping the heavy gold pen against the signature line, aggressively trying to force it directly into my right hand. He leaned in again, his shadow completely blocking the natural light from my living room window, whispering that I was out of options and had nowhere to run. I stared at the heavy gold pen Jamal was trying to force into my hand. I did not blink. I did not flinch. Instead, I calmly reached up, grabbed his wrist, and pushed his hand away from me. I told him that physical intimidation might work on his desperate creditors, but it would not work on a federal auditor who knew exactly how empty his threats really were. Jamal stepped back, clearly surprised by my lack of fear. He was used to women cowering when he raised his voice. But before he could formulate a response, Brittany decided it was time to step onto the stage. She dramatically dropped her white Prada bag onto my sofa, crossed her arms, and let out a loud, exaggerated sob. She cried out that I was doing this on purpose just to ruin her life. Her face twisted into a mask of pure victimhood. "You have always been like this, Vanessa," she wailed, her voice echoing shrilly off my apartment walls. "You are just jealous. You have always been jealous of me. You are sitting in this miserable, lonely apartment with no husband, no social life, and absolutely zero style, so you want to destroy my marriage out of pure spite." Jamal is a provider. He is building a legacy for our family, and you cannot stand the fact that I am married to a successful entrepreneur while you are just a glorified calculator punching numbers for a paycheck. I looked at my sister, marveling at her absolute delusion. She genuinely believed the rented yacht and the high-interest designer bags were signs of actual wealth. She was completely blind to the financial cliff she was standing on. I opened my mouth to correct her, but Patricia immediately stepped in to shield her precious golden child. Patricia pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. "Do not you dare look at your sister with that smug expression," Patricia hissed, her eyes narrowing with decades of manufactured resentment. "Brittany is absolutely right. You have been a bitter, selfish girl since the day you were born. You always had to ruin everything for her. Do you remember when we bought Brittany her first car for college, and you threw a tantrum because you had to take out student loans? You never appreciated what we did for you. You always thought you were better than us. And now, when your brother-in-law offers you a chance to finally be a useful part of this family, you throw it right back in our faces." The gaslighting was textbook. According to Patricia, my lifelong dedication to my education and my refusal to demand handouts was a character flaw, while Brittany demanding a brand new car and maxing out credit cards was a virtue. I was the permanent scapegoat, the designated villain of the family narrative, existing only to serve their needs or take the blame for their failures. I took a slow, deep breath, refusing to let the childhood trauma bait me into an emotional reaction. I looked past my mother and locked eyes with Jamal. I asked him if he wanted to tell his wife the truth or if he wanted me to do it for him. Jamal puffed out his chest, adjusting his suit jacket in a pathetic attempt to regain his dominant posture. "I have nothing to hide," he declared loudly, though a bead of sweat was forming near his hairline. "My company is thriving. In fact, Apex Logistics Solutions just closed a massive $50,000 distribution contract last Thursday. We are swimming in capital right now, Vanessa. We just need this SBA loan as a temporary bridge until the corporate funds clear. You know how slow the banking system is." I let out a short, genuine laugh. It was the laugh of someone who held all the cards in a very high-stakes game. I leaned against the kitchen counter, crossing my ankles to show just how unbothered I was. I looked straight at Jamal and asked him how a company that supposedly closed a $50,000 contract last Thursday managed to bounce a daily automatic withdrawal of exactly $412 yesterday morning. The silence that followed was absolute. The smug expression completely vanished from Jamal's face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. I did not stop there. I kept my voice perfectly level and clinically precise, delivering the facts like a prosecutor in a courtroom. I told him I knew all about his merchant cash advances. I listed off the names of 3 aggressive alternative lenders he had borrowed from in the last 6 months. I pointed out that his corporate bank account was currently overdrawn by nearly $2,000 and that the lender who financed the white Range Rover Brittany loved so much had already initiated repossession protocols due to 3 consecutive missed payments. Brittany stopped her fake crying. She looked at Jamal, total confusion washing over her perfectly contoured face. "Jamal," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly as the illusion cracked. "What is she talking about? What merchant cash advances? What does she mean the car is in repossession?" Jamal opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked like a deer caught in the headlights of a massive truck. He knew that I knew everything. And more importantly, he realized that his carefully constructed house of cards was collapsing right in the middle of my living room. Jamal stammered, his expensive facade crumbling completely under the weight of the truth. He looked at Brittany, then back at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He tried to laugh it off, attempting to paste that smug, arrogant grin back onto his face, but his eyes were wide with genuine panic. He told Brittany I was just making things up because I was bitter. He insisted that the repossession notice was just a minor clerical error at the bank and that the merchant cash advances were standard venture capital procedures. But Brittany was not entirely stupid, even if she was willfully ignorant. She looked at the cheap Prada bag on the sofa, then at her husband's sweating forehead. She shrieked, demanding to know if her car was actually going to be taken away. She grabbed Jamal by the lapels of his ill-fitting custom suit and started screaming about how her friends at the country club would laugh at her if she got repossessed. The living room instantly devolved into a chaotic screaming match between the two of them, entirely ignoring the fact that they were standing in my apartment. Patricia, however, did not care about the car or the country club. She only cared about the money. She pushed past Jamal and marched right back up to me, her face purple with rage. She screamed that none of this mattered and that it was exactly why I needed to sign the guarantor application right now. She insisted that if Jamal was struggling, it was my absolute duty as family to bail him out before the situation got worse. She shoved the banking documents across the granite counter again, knocking over my pen holder in the process. I calmly picked up my phone and unlocked the screen. I held it up so Patricia could clearly see the numbers I was dialing. 911. My thumb hovered directly over the green call button. I told them they had exactly 60 seconds to get out of my apartment before I told the police dispatcher there were 3 hostile intruders refusing to leave my property. I made it incredibly clear that I would press formal trespassing charges, and since Jamal was already dodging aggressive debt collectors, a police record would probably fast-track his financial ruin. Jamal froze. He looked at my phone, then at my face, realizing I was not bluffing. The last thing a man running a fraudulent shell company wanted was law enforcement showing up to document his whereabouts. He grabbed Brittany by the arm, roughly pulling her toward the front door. He muttered under his breath that I was crazy and that they did not need my help anyway. He claimed he had a dozen other investors lined up who would gladly take the deal. Brittany fought against his grip, sobbing hysterically about her Range Rover and her ruined Miami vacation. She kicked my front door open, stumbling out into the hallway while screaming at Jamal to call the bank and fix the clerical error immediately. Jamal followed her out. His shoulders slumped, his confident swagger completely erased by the brutal reality of his collapsing lies. In the midst of the loud, chaotic exit, I stepped out from behind the kitchen island to make sure they were actually leaving the building. I walked toward the front door, keeping my eyes fixed on Jamal and Brittany as their argument echoed down the stairwell. I did not realize that Patricia had intentionally lagged behind. While my attention was focused entirely on getting my sister and brother-in-law out of my home, Patricia was standing next to my small home office desk near the entryway. Earlier that morning, I had been organizing my personal files to lock down my credit. A thick manila folder was sitting near the edge of the desk. Printed clearly on the tab was my full legal name and the current tax year. Inside that folder were my most recent W-2 forms, my unredacted bank statements, and a freshly printed copy of my credit report, which prominently featured my full Social Security number. Patricia watched me step toward the door. Without making a single sound, she reached out, slid the manila folder off my desk, and smoothly dropped it into her oversized designer handbag. She snapped the bag shut just as I turned back around to face her. I pointed a rigid finger toward the open doorway. I told her to get out and never come back. Patricia offered me a cold, chilling smile that did not reach her eyes. She adjusted her handbag over her shoulder, her posture suddenly radiating a strange, terrifying confidence that had not been there just a few seconds ago. She told me I would regret this. She promised me that I had just made the biggest mistake of my entire life, and that family always finds a way to collect what is owed. She stepped out into the hallway, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor as she walked away. I slammed the heavy wooden door shut behind her and instantly threw the deadbolt. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood, letting out a massive breath of relief. I listened to their footsteps fading down the stairs, followed by the heavy slam of the building's main entrance door. The apartment was finally quiet. The suffocating tension was gone. I walked back into my living room, looking at the unsigned bank documents they had left sitting on my kitchen counter. I gathered them up and threw them directly into the trash can. I felt a profound sense of victory. I had stood my ground, exposed their lies, and successfully defended my financial boundaries. I thought I had completely protected myself. I had absolutely no idea that as Patricia walked to her car, she was carrying the exact keys needed to destroy my entire life. For the next 5 days, I lived in a state of cautious optimism. I truly believed the worst was over. I went back to my routine, diving into my forensic accounting casework during the day and enjoying the quiet solitude of my apartment at night. I assumed my threat to call the police had successfully scared Jamal straight. I figured he and Brittany were busy scrambling to sell off their designer watches to appease the loan sharks. I had placed standard fraud alerts on my credit files, trusting that those basic digital barriers would be enough to protect me from any retaliatory financial sabotage. I completely underestimated the sheer ruthlessness of my own mother. It happened on a Tuesday night. The digital clock on my nightstand read exactly 12:14 in the morning. I was fast asleep, exhausted from a grueling 10-hour shift auditing a corporate bankruptcy case. The sudden sharp vibration of my phone buzzing against the wooden nightstand jolted me awake. I groaned, rolling over and squinting at the bright screen. I expected it to be a server alert from my firm or perhaps an automated update from a software vendor. Instead, the notification banner glowing in the darkroom made my blood run absolutely cold. The email was from Chase Bank. The subject line read, "Congratulations, your commercial loan has been approved." I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart hammering fiercely against my ribs. I practically ripped the phone off the charger, my thumbs fumbling as I unlocked the screen and opened the email application. I stared at the bold black text, my mind struggling to process the impossible numbers on the screen. The message read, "Dear Vanessa, congratulations on the successful approval of your $500,000 collateralized commercial loan. The funds will be dispersed to your designated corporate account within 24 to 48 hours. Thank you for choosing Chase Bank for your business financing needs. $500,000. $500,000. My hands started to shake so violently that I almost dropped the phone onto the floor. I had never applied for a commercial loan in my entire life. I did not even own a registered business entity that would require commercial financing. I immediately opened a secure web browser and logged into my primary credit monitoring dashboard. I bypassed the standard user interface and pulled the raw data feed directly from the credit bureaus. There it was, a massive, glaring hard inquiry from Chase Bank's commercial lending division dated just 2 days ago. Following the inquiry was a newly opened trade line, a $500,000 debt securely attached to my social security number. Panic threatened to swallow me whole. How did they bypass my fraud alerts? How did they pass the identity verification protocols? Then the sickening realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. I remembered Patricia lingering by my desk during the chaotic eviction from my apartment. I remembered the manila folder that had mysteriously vanished after I kicked them out. She had stolen my most recent W-2 forms, my unredacted bank statements, and my complete credit report. She had my exact social security number, but it was even worse than just stealing documents. To bypass a banking security verification, the applicant usually has to answer highly specific out-of-wallet questions. Things like the name of the street you grew up on, the model of your first car, or the county where your parents were married. A random identity thief would fail those security checks. But Patricia was my mother. She knew the answer to every single security question the banking system could possibly ask. She weaponized her maternal knowledge to impersonate me flawlessly. They had taken the stolen documents, forged my signature on the guarantor application, and submitted the entire package to a desperate loan officer looking to meet a monthly quota. And because my credit score was an immaculate 820, the automated underwriting system had practically rubber-stamped the approval. I threw my blanket off and paced across my dark bedroom, the adrenaline completely overriding my exhaustion. My own mother and my brother-in-law had successfully executed a massive coordinated identity theft against me. They had bound me to a $500,000 financial anchor, ensuring that when Jamal's fake tech startup inevitably imploded, I would be the one forced into total bankruptcy. I would lose my CPA license. My entire career in the financial sector would be destroyed. They were perfectly willing to completely ruin my life just to keep their rented luxury cars and weekend yacht trips. The sheer scale of the betrayal was paralyzing. A normal person would have immediately panicked, called the bank's fraud department hotline, and demanded they freeze the wire transfer before the money moved. I reached for my phone, my thumb hovering over the Chase Bank emergency contact number. I was one button press away from shutting the whole thing down. I stared at the glowing green call icon, my chest heaving as I prepared to report the fraudulent transaction. But then my forensic auditor instincts kicked in, freezing my hand in midair. I realized that if I canceled the loan right now, Patricia would just claim it was a misunderstanding. She would lie her way out of it, and Jamal would walk away scot-free. If I truly wanted to stop them forever, I could not just play defense. I had to let them commit the ultimate crime. If I called the bank fraud department right then and there, the loan would simply be flagged and canceled. Chase Bank would deny the disbursement. Jamal would not get his money, and Patricia would undoubtedly play the victim. She would claim she thought she had my permission to apply on my behalf. She would say it was a simple misunderstanding between a mother and daughter. The local police would likely treat it as a civil dispute, a messy family matter rather than a serious felony. They would escape any real consequences, and they would just find another way to ruin me later. I needed an ironclad case. I needed them caught dead to rights. In the world of financial crime, attempted fraud is notoriously difficult to prosecute when family members are involved. But federal wire fraud is a completely different beast. The moment Chase Bank transferred that $500,000 across digital state lines and deposited it into Jamal's corporate account, a massive legal threshold would be crossed. It would automatically trigger federal jurisdiction. The penalty for wire fraud involving a federally insured banking institution carries a maximum sentence of 30 years in prison. I did not want to give them a simple slap on the wrist. I wanted to give them a federal indictment. I put my phone down and walked into my home office. I opened my encrypted work laptop and immediately began taking time-stamped screenshots of the approval email, the credit inquiry, and the new trade line on my credit report. I documented everything in a secure offline folder. Then I pulled up the personal contact information for Special Agent David Reynolds. David was a senior investigator in the FBI White-Collar Crime Division based out of the Chicago field office. We had worked closely together 2 years ago on a massive corporate embezzlement joint task force. He knew my meticulous work ethic, and he knew my absolute obsession with following the law to the letter. I waited until exactly 6 in the morning and dialed his direct cell phone number. He answered on the third ring, his voice gruff with sleep. I apologized for the early intrusion, but I told him I had a verified active bank fraud taking place involving a $500,000 collateralized loan. That woke him up instantly. I explained the entire situation, stripping away all the emotional family drama and laying out the pure financial facts. I told him about the stolen tax documents, the forged signature, and Jamal's failing shell company, Apex Logistics Solutions. David asked me if I had frozen the pending transfer yet. I told him no, and I explicitly told him I did not want to stop it. I asked him to initiate a federal monitor on the receiving account instead. I wanted the FBI to watch the funds clear the Federal Reserve System and land directly in Jamal's lap. David fell silent for a moment before warning me about the extreme risk I was taking. He said if the bank released the funds and Jamal managed to immediately wire the money offshore or withdraw it in cash, I would be legally on the hook for $500,000. It was a terrifying gamble. My perfect credit score, my apartment, my entire future would be utterly destroyed if we failed to freeze his accounts the exact second the money landed. I told David I was willing to take the risk. I knew Jamal. I knew he was not a sophisticated criminal mastermind with offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. He was a desperate, arrogant narcissist. The moment that money hit his account, he would not hide it. He would immediately try to pay off his aggressive loan sharks to save his precious Range Rover, and he would likely throw a massive party to show off his fake wealth to his friends. David finally agreed to make the calls to his superiors and secure a federal monitoring warrant. He told me to go about my day completely normally and wait for his signal. For the next 48 hours, I lived on a knife edge of anxiety. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart leaped directly into my throat. I watched my banking dashboard constantly waiting for the pending transaction to switch to a completed status. I was playing a dangerous game of financial chicken with my own mother. But I knew that once the trap snapped shut, there would be no turning back for any of them. Then, on Thursday afternoon, my phone rang. But it was not David calling to confirm the wire transfer. It was Patricia. And the horrifying secret she was about to casually reveal would turn my cold, calculated trap into a desperate race against time. I quickly answered the phone, immediately pressing the speaker button to record the entire conversation on my encrypted work laptop. I sat perfectly still, waiting silently for her to speak. "Hello, Vanessa," Patricia crooned. Her voice dripped with a sickening condescension I had not heard since I was a teenager. "I just wanted to call and give you an update since you were so concerned about your brother-in-law's financial situation." I kept my voice perfectly flat, aggressively masking the intense rage that was boiling inside me. I took a deep breath and calmly asked her exactly what it was she wanted from me today. "You missed your chance to be part of the winning team." Patricia laughed loudly into the receiver. The sound was incredibly sharp, grating, and undeniably cruel. "Jamal just secured $500,000 in commercial funding. The wire transfer cleared this morning. Brittany is already out shopping to celebrate. We did not need your precious credit score after all. When family sticks together, doors open." I clenched my jaw, staring at the audio waveform on my screen. I knew exactly whose credit score opened that door, but I needed her to confess. I played dumb, injecting doubt into my voice to stroke her ego. I asked her exactly how a man facing vehicle repossessions convinced a bank to hand over $500,000. Patricia sighed, adopting the tone of a teacher explaining math to a slow child. "Because Vanessa, I stepped up. I did what a real mother does. I provided collateral. The bank needed a tangible asset to back the loan, and since you were acting like a selfish brat, I had to look elsewhere." My blood ran cold. I knew she had stolen my identity to act as the guarantor for the loan, but a commercial loan of that size almost always required hard collateral. I asked her, my voice trembling slightly with genuine fear, what exact asset she used as collateral. Patricia did not even hesitate. Blinded by her own arrogance, she confessed to a federal crime with absolute pride. "I used your grandmother's house," she said casually. "It has been completely paid off for 30 years. It is prime real estate. The equity was just sitting there doing absolutely nothing while Jamal was struggling. It was the perfect solution." I stopped breathing. The walls of my office felt like they were rapidly closing in on me. Beatrice's house. The small brick bungalow where my grandmother had lived for 4 decades. The house where she had given me the only unconditional love I had ever known. I asked her how she possibly convinced Beatrice to sign over the deed to her only home. Beatrice despised Jamal and saw right through his flashy, empty lifestyle. She would never agree to leverage her safety for his fake startup. I did not need her permission. Patricia scoffed, sounding deeply annoyed by my question. "I am her daughter. I know what is best for her financial portfolio. Remember when she had that hip replacement surgery a few months ago? While she was heavily medicated on painkillers, I had her sign a blanket power of attorney document. I told her it was standard medical paperwork in case of an emergency. The bank accepted it without a single question. I pledged the house and Jamal got his money. Everyone wins." A wave of profound nausea washed over me. She had not just stolen my identity. She had financially ambushed a 78-year-old woman while she was recovering from major surgery. By using the forged power of attorney, Patricia had legally bound Beatrice's paid-off home to the $500,000 fraudulent loan. Because my stolen identity was the guarantor, and Beatrice's home was the collateral, Chase Bank had a direct legal right to seize the property the exact moment Jamal finally defaulted. Patricia continued to gloat, completely oblivious to the fact that she had just handed me the final nail for her coffin. So you can sit in your tiny apartment with your spreadsheets, Vanessa. We are celebrating tonight. Jamal is a millionaire now, and you are nothing but an afterthought. She abruptly hung up the phone. I sat completely frozen in my office chair, silently staring at the disconnected digital screen. The game had just changed entirely. This was no longer just about protecting my credit score or letting Jamal hang himself with a wire fraud charge. The FBI monitoring the funds was not enough anymore. If the bank realized the loan was fraudulent before the FBI froze the assets, they would immediately initiate foreclosure proceedings to recoup their losses. They would come to take Beatrice's home. I slammed my laptop shut, grabbed my car keys, and sprinted out the front door. I practically flew down the stairs of my apartment building. My mind was racing faster than my car as I navigated the heavy afternoon traffic of Chicago. The 20-minute drive to the south suburbs felt like an absolute eternity. Every single red light was a literal physical torture. I kept replaying Patricia's sickeningly cheerful voice in my head. She had used a forged power of attorney to pledge Beatrice's home as collateral for a $500,000 loan. It was the ultimate betrayal. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my fingers cramped. I pulled onto Beatrice's quiet tree-lined street and aggressively parked my car halfway up the driveway. I did not even bother locking the doors as I sprinted up the front walkway to the small brick bungalow. I used my spare key to unlock the heavy wooden front door. I called out her name, my voice echoing slightly in the narrow hallway. There was no answer. Panic gripped my chest. I hurried into the living room, and my heart completely shattered at the sight before me. Beatrice was sitting in her worn floral armchair, looking smaller and more fragile than I had ever seen her. She was trembling violently. Her face was pale, and tears were streaming silently down her deeply lined cheeks. In her shaking hands, she clutched a thick stack of papers bearing the official letterhead of Chase Bank. I rushed over and dropped to my knees beside her chair. I gently took her hands in mine, asking her what was wrong. She could barely speak through her quiet sobs. She handed the papers to me. I quickly scanned the first page. It was a formal notice of collateralization and a preliminary warning of default risk. The bank was legally required to notify the property owner that their home was now tied to a commercial loan. Beatrice looked at me with pure terror in her eyes. She asked me why the bank was threatening to take her home. She told me she had paid off her mortgage 30 years ago. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to remain calm for her sake. I asked her if she remembered signing anything for Patricia recently. Beatrice closed her eyes, trying to concentrate through her distress. She remembered being in the recovery facility 3 months ago after her hip replacement surgery. She was heavily medicated on strong painkillers, drifting in and out of a deep mental fog. She recalled Patricia visiting her late one evening. Patricia had brought a stack of papers, claiming they were urgent medical release forms required by the hospital billing department. Patricia had held the pen for her, guiding her shaky hand to the signature line. Beatrice wept softly, apologizing over and over again. She said she trusted her daughter. She thought Patricia was just helping her manage the confusing hospital bills. She had absolutely no idea she was signing a blanket power of attorney, handing over complete legal control of her financial life. The sheer depravity of Patricia's actions made me physically sick. She had preyed on an elderly woman in her most vulnerable, heavily medicated state. She had cruelly weaponized her trusted role as a caretaker to steal the single most valuable asset her mother possessed, all to fund Jamal's pathetic illusions of grandeur. And now, Beatrice was sitting in her living room, utterly terrified that she was going to be thrown out onto the street in the twilight of her life. The safety and security she had worked decades to build had been ripped away by her own flesh and blood. I wrapped my arms tightly around her small shoulders, pulling her into a fierce embrace. I let her cry against my shoulder, stroking her silver hair. I could feel her frail frame shaking with every sob. The anger inside me solidified into something cold, heavy, and unbreakable. I was not just going to send Jamal to prison. I was going to completely dismantle their entire lives. I pulled back slightly, looking directly into my grandmother's tear-filled eyes. I wiped the tears from her cheeks with my thumbs. I kept my voice incredibly steady and calm, projecting an absolute certainty that I hoped would pierce through her overwhelming panic. I told her to take a deep breath. I promised her that nobody was going to take her home. I told her the bank notice was nothing more than a piece of trash. Beatrice sniffled, looking at me with heartbreaking confusion. She asked me how I could possibly stop a massive bank from foreclosing on a legal pledge. I smiled gently, squeezing her hands. I told her there was a massive legal secret Patricia did not know, a hidden protection I had quietly set up long ago to keep her safe. Beatrice stared at me, her tear-filled eyes searching my face for any sign of false hope. I held her gaze with unwavering certainty. I pulled a tissue from the box on her side table and gently dabbed at her wet cheeks. I told her the bank was sending those scary letters because they were operating under the assumption that the papers Patricia had her sign were actually valid. But the truth was, Patricia had fundamentally misunderstood who truly owned the house. I explained that a power of attorney only gives someone the right to manage assets that the signer actually possesses. If the signer does not own the asset anymore, the legal document is completely worthless. Beatrice looked confused. She told me she had lived in this house since the 1970s and had never sold it to anyone. I smiled again, a deep sense of relief washing over me as I realized my paranoid planning from half a decade ago was about to save her life. I gently asked Beatrice to think back to 5 years ago, right after my grandfather passed away. Patricia had suddenly become incredibly interested in Beatrice's estate planning. I reminded my grandmother of the time Patricia brought over a shady estate planner trying to convince her to put the house into a joint tenancy with right of survivorship. Patricia had claimed it was just to avoid probate court and save on taxes. But as a newly minted accountant back then, I had reviewed the paperwork. I saw right through the disguise. If Beatrice had signed that joint tenancy agreement, Patricia could have borrowed against the equity of the home whenever she wanted, without ever asking for permission. When I confronted Patricia about it back then, she screamed at me, accusing me of interfering with family business, and stormed out of the house. That was the exact moment I realized my mother was actively plotting to treat her own parents' life savings like her personal piggy bank. I knew Jamal was already draining Brittany's accounts, and it was only a matter of time before their financial desperation led them directly to Beatrice's doorstep. So a month after that massive fight, I had taken Beatrice to my own firm's senior legal counsel. I reminded her of the long afternoon we spent in that downtown office drinking tea and signing a massive stack of complex paperwork. I had told Beatrice we were just updating her living will and protecting her assets from medical creditors. But we did much more than that. We had executed an irrevocable trust. We legally transferred the entire deed of the brick bungalow out of Beatrice's name and placed it directly into the trust, naming myself as the sole trustee and ultimate beneficiary. By doing so, Beatrice legally surrendered ownership of the property in exchange for a lifetime right of residency. It meant nobody could ever take the house from her, not even if they tricked her into signing 1,000,000 power of attorney forms. Beatrice gasped, her hands flying up to cover her mouth as the realization finally hit her. She realized she did not own the house when she signed Patricia's fraudulent hospital papers. The asset belonged to the trust. Therefore, Patricia had just fraudulently pledged an asset she did not own to secure a federal loan. It was a completely dead contract. The bank could never foreclose on a house that belonged to a legally bulletproof trust. I squeezed her shoulders tightly and looked her dead in the eye. "Don't cry, Grandma. They don't know it, but I've been planning for this exact moment for 5 years." The profound weight of my words settled over the quiet living room. I watched the absolute terror slowly drain from Beatrice's face, replaced first by utter shock, and then by a profound, overwhelming relief. She let out a long, shaky breath and leaned forward, wrapping her arms around my neck. She hugged me tighter than she had in years, burying her face in my shoulder as tears of pure gratitude soaked my shirt. I held her just as tightly, feeling a fierce fire burning inside my chest. I had successfully insulated the only person in the world who had ever truly loved me from the toxic destruction of my mother's greed. I pulled back and gently took the foreclosure warning letter from her trembling hands. I folded it neatly in half and slid it into my blazer pocket. I told her she did not need to worry about Chase Bank or the federal government or Jamal's fake tech startup ever again. I promised her that the only people who were going to lose their homes and their freedom were the ones who tried to steal hers. I stood up, smiling with cold resolve. I left Beatrice's house that evening feeling a profound sense of clarity. The suffocating anxiety that had plagued me for days was completely gone, replaced by a razor-sharp focus. I drove back to my apartment in Logan Square, my mind actively constructing the perfect sequence of events for their inevitable downfall. I knew the FBI task force was aggressively monitoring the wire transfer, and I knew Jamal's accounts were essentially a ticking time bomb. But I did not want them to just be arrested quietly. I wanted them publicly exposed at the height of their unearned arrogance. My opportunity presented itself the very next morning. I was sitting at my kitchen island sipping black coffee when my phone buzzed with an incoming text message. It was a digital invitation forwarded by Patricia. The header was written in an obnoxious gold script. It read, "You are cordially invited to celebrate the massive expansion and angel funding of Apex Logistics Solutions." The venue they chose was one of the most exclusive Michelin star restaurants in downtown Chicago. A single reservation there cost hundreds of dollars, and booking a private room required a massive upfront deposit. Jamal was literally using the fraudulent federal loan money secured by my stolen identity and Beatrice's home to buy a ridiculously expensive dinner just to brag. The sheer audacity was staggering. Attached to the invitation was a personal text from Patricia. She wrote, "We booked a private room for tonight. Jamal's new investors just cleared $500,000. I expect you to be there at 7 sharp. You need to come and learn how real business is done instead of hiding in your cheap apartment. Swallow your pride and apologize. Bring your own credit card because you are paying for your own plate." I stared at the glowing screen, a slow, predatory smile spreading across my face. They were throwing a victory party with stolen money, entirely unaware that federal investigators were already tracking every single penny. Patricia wanted me to come and witness her golden child's triumph. She wanted to humiliate me in front of our extended family to prove once and for all that Jamal was the successful entrepreneur and I was just the bitter sibling. I decided it would be incredibly rude to decline such a generous invitation. I spent the entire afternoon meticulously preparing my arsenal. I printed out high-resolution copies of the Chase Bank loan approval, the forged guarantor application featuring my stolen Social Security number, and the flagged trade line on my credit report. I also printed the public records of Jamal's actively defaulting merchant cash advances. Finally, I prepared the ultimate trump card. I went into my fireproof safe and pulled out the original notarized copy of Beatrice's irrevocable trust deed. I placed all these documents into 3 separate manila folders, stamped them with my official firm seal, and slid them into my briefcase. If I was going to execute a complete financial and legal demolition, I was going to dress the part. I bypassed my standard office attire and pulled out a tailored, razor-sharp black pantsuit I usually reserved for high-stakes federal court testimonies. I paired it with a crisp white silk blouse and black stiletto heels. I pulled my hair back into a tight bun and applied a coat of dark red lipstick. I looked in the mirror. I did not look like the scapegoat daughter they could constantly bully. I looked like an executioner. By 6:45 that evening, I was handing my car keys to the valet outside the restaurant. The cool Chicago evening air whipped around me as I stood on the sidewalk looking up at the elegant facade. The restaurant was a temple of high society, a place where legitimate titans of industry celebrated actual milestones. Jamal was treating it like a playground funded entirely by a felony. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a brief text from Special Agent David Reynolds. The message consisted of only 4 words. "The trap is set." I slipped my phone back into my pocket, gripping the heavy handle of my leather briefcase. I stepped through the massive glass doors, the ambient chatter and clinking of crystal glasses washing over me. The hostess greeted me with a warm smile, asking for my reservation name. I told her I was with the Apex Logistics private party. She nodded respectfully and motioned for me to follow her down a dimly lit, luxurious corridor. As we approached the heavy oak doors of the private dining room, I could hear Jamal's booming, arrogant laughter echoing from inside. They were currently at the very peak of their delusion, completely oblivious to the fact that I was about to burn their entire fake empire to the ground. The hostess pushed open the heavy oak doors, revealing a scene that looked like a parody of extreme wealth. The private dining room featured rich velvet and gold accents, with a crystal chandelier casting a warm glow over a mahogany table. Silver platters piled high with fresh oysters, caviar, and thick cuts of Wagyu beef covered every available inch of the table. At the head of the room stood Jamal. He held a flute of vintage champagne high in the air. He held court in front of a dozen extended family members. I recognized aunts, uncles, and several cousins who had historically bought into Patricia and Brittany's manufactured narrative of superiority. Jamal had traded his ill-fitting daytime suit for an even more ostentatious black velvet dinner jacket with silk lapels. The thick gold chain around his neck caught the chandelier light as he gestured expansively with his free hand. He was in the middle of a pompous, self-congratulatory toast, his voice booming over the soft classical music playing from the hidden speakers. "It takes a special kind of vision to see the future," Jamal proclaimed, taking a slow, theatrical sip of his champagne. "When I founded Apex Logistics Solutions, people told me I was dreaming too big. They said the market was saturated. But true entrepreneurs do not listen to small-minded people. We push boundaries. And today, the financial world officially recognized that vision to the tune of $500,000 in capital funding. We did not even have to pitch them. They practically begged to partner with us." A chorus of impressed murmurs and applause broke out around the table. Patricia was sitting immediately to his right, beaming with an expression of intense, fanatical pride. Brittany was on his left, flashing her diamond rings and nodding along as if she had personally engineered this massive business victory. "There are two types of people in this world," Jamal continued, a smug, mocking grin spreading across his face as he paced slightly at the head of the table. "There are creators and there are employees. Creators build empires. Employees just punch a clock and hope for a modest pension. Take my sister-in-law, Vanessa, for example." He paused, letting my name hang in the air for maximum dramatic effect. He still had not noticed me standing silently in the shadows near the doorway. "Vanessa is a smart girl," Jamal said, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. "But she possesses an employee mindset. She sits in a cubicle 40 hours weekly, terrified of taking a risk. She crunches numbers and counts other people's money because she lacks the courage to go out and make her own. That safe, boring 9-to-5 life might be fine for some people, but it is exactly why she will never understand what it takes to operate at this level of success." The extended family chuckled. Brittany let out a loud, mocking laugh, taking a sip of her drink. I stood perfectly still, letting his words wash over me. He was standing there wearing clothes bought with predatory loans, bragging about a $500,000 federal wire fraud, and lecturing me on financial courage. The absolute irony of the situation was intoxicating. I tightened my grip on the handle of my leather briefcase and stepped fully into the light of the chandelier. My black stiletto heels clicked sharply against the hardwood border of the room, a rhythmic, authoritative sound that immediately cut through the laughter. The conversation died instantly. Heads turned one by one. I did not shrink under their collective gaze. I held my head high, my tailored black pantsuit radiating a cold, intimidating professionalism that completely clashed with their festive, chaotic energy. I walked slowly down the length of the long mahogany table, my eyes locked entirely on Jamal. The arrogant smirk melted off his face for a fraction of a second, quickly replaced by a forced, overly enthusiastic smile. He raised his champagne glass toward me, gesturing for the rest of the room to look. "Ah, the accountant finally arrives," Jamal announced loudly, though his voice had lost a tiny fraction of its booming confidence. Look, everyone, Vanessa decided to grace us with her presence after all. Come on in, Vanessa, pull up a chair. I was just telling the family about the massive difference between working for a paycheck and actually building generational wealth. Maybe if you pay close attention tonight, you might learn a thing or two about real business. Patricia leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she took in my appearance. She noticed the briefcase. She noticed the absolute lack of defeat in my posture. "You are late," Patricia snapped, her tone sharp and commanding. "Sit down quietly, and remember what I told you. You are paying for whatever you order." I did not sit down. I walked directly to the empty space at the opposite end of the mahogany table, directly facing Jamal, across the expanse of expensive food and crystal glasses. I placed my heavy leather briefcase flat on the table with a solid echoing thud. I looked at Jamal, then at Patricia, and finally at Brittany. I offered them a slow, utterly emotionless smile. I told Jamal that I had actually come to talk about his generational wealth, and I brought all the paperwork to prove exactly how he built it. Jamal let out a loud, forced laugh that cracked slightly at the end. He desperately tried to brush off my comment as a bitter joke, waving his hand toward the rest of the table. He told the family I was just upset because I had missed out on the initial investment round. But before I could reach for the brass latches of my briefcase to pull out the federal documents, Patricia abruptly pushed her chair back. The heavy wooden legs scraped against the polished floor. She marched around the mahogany table, her face flushed dark red with fury. She did not want me opening that briefcase in front of our aunts and uncles. Patricia grabbed my arm with a grip that was surprisingly strong and forcefully pulled me away from the table. She dragged me toward the heavy oak doors, pushing them open just enough to shove me out into the quiet corridor. The heavy doors swung shut behind us, muting the chatter of the extended family. Patricia released my arm and pointed a sharp, manicured finger directly at my chest. She kept her voice at a harsh, venomous whisper, so the other restaurant patrons walking by would not hear her. She asked me what exactly I thought I was doing. She accused me of being a deeply disturbed, jealous woman who could not stand to see her own sister thrive. I stood tall, smoothing out the sleeve of my silk blouse. I told her I was simply bringing transparency to a family dinner. Patricia scoffed, rolling her eyes with absolute disgust. She looked me up and down, sneering at my tailored suit. She told me that wearing a nice outfit did not change who I was. She leaned in close, her voice dripping with pure arrogance. She informed me that with this massive influx of capital, Jamal and Brittany were officially entering Chicago high society. They were already looking at luxury real estate in the prestigious Gold Coast neighborhood. They were preparing to join exclusive country clubs, attend high-profile charity galas, and network with actual millionaires. They were building a legacy, and I was actively dragging them down. Patricia stated that my very presence in the city was a complete embarrassment to their newly elevated status. She claimed that having a bitter entry-level accountant for a sister would completely ruin Brittany's carefully crafted brand. She said Jamal's new investors would be horrified if they found out his sister-in-law lived in a cramped Logan Square apartment and actively tried to sabotage his success out of pure spite. Then she delivered her ultimate demand. She looked me dead in the eye and told me I needed to move out of Chicago immediately. She demanded I pack up my cheap apartment, resign from my accounting firm, and relocate to another state by the end of the month. She did not care where I went as long as I was far away from their perfect new life. She even had the audacity to offer to pay for my moving truck, claiming it would be a small price to pay to permanently rid their family of my constant negativity. I listened to her unhinged rant, analyzing every single word. She genuinely believed this stolen $500,000 had elevated them to the upper echelon of society. She thought she had won. She thought her identity theft and fraudulent mortgage pledge had successfully bought her a ticket to the Billionaire Boys Club. She had completely lost touch with reality, intoxicated by money that did not even belong to her. Patricia warned me that if I refused to leave, she would make sure every single family member cut contact with me. She threatened to isolate me entirely, promising that I would never be allowed to speak to my aunts, my cousins, or even my grandmother Beatrice ever again. The mention of Beatrice almost made me smile. Patricia truly believed she still controlled the narrative, unaware that Beatrice was sitting safely in her legally untouchable home, fully aware of the monster her daughter had become. I looked at Patricia feeling absolutely no anger anymore. I only felt a profound, chilling pity. I asked her if she honestly believed a single wire transfer could erase years of financial incompetence and turn Jamal into a respectable businessman. Patricia stepped back, her eyes flashing with renewed rage. She told me I was delusional and commanded me to take my briefcase and walk out the restaurant front door before she had the restaurant security throw me out. I shook my head slowly, gripping the handle of my briefcase tighter. I calmly reached past her and pushed the heavy oak doors back open. I told her I was not going anywhere and the celebration was just getting started. I stepped back into the private dining room, leaving a completely stunned Patricia standing in the doorway. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind her as she scrambled to follow me back inside, her face now a mixture of absolute fury and creeping panic. The ambient chatter of our extended family had resumed during our brief absence, but it died down immediately as I walked straight back toward my spot at the end of the mahogany table. Jamal was pouring himself another glass of champagne, pretending to ignore me, but his eyes darted nervously in my direction. Before I could even reach the table, my sister decided it was her turn to defend her husband's fragile ego. Brittany stood up from her chair, her diamond bracelets clinking loudly against her champagne glass. She walked toward me with a slow, exaggerated strut hips, swaying in her designer cocktail dress. She stopped just a few feet away, crossing her arms and looking me up and down with an expression of profound pity. She was playing to the audience, making sure every aunt, uncle, and cousin in the room was watching her put the bitter older sister back in her place. "Vanessa, you really need to stop embarrassing yourself," Brittany said, her voice dripping with fake sugary concern. "You come in here crashing our celebration wearing that stiff black suit, like you are heading to a funeral. I know you are upset that you are stuck in a dead-end job while Jamal is out here making massive moves, but throwing a tantrum is not going to change your bank account." I stood completely silent, letting her dig her grave as deeply as she wanted. My silence only emboldened her. She turned back to the table, picking up her white Prada handbag, the exact same bag I knew was financed by a predatory merchant cash advance. She unclasped the gold hardware and reached inside, pulling out a sleek leather wallet. Brittany pulled out a crisp, brand-new $100 bill. She held it delicately between her manicured fingers and extended it toward me. "Here," Brittany said, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. "Take this. Go buy yourself some decent makeup and maybe a colorful blouse. You look completely exhausted. Consider it a charitable donation from Apex Logistics Solutions. We believe in giving back to the less fortunate." The private dining room erupted into laughter. Uncle Richard chuckled loudly, shaking his head. A few of my younger cousins covered their mouths, giggling at the sheer disrespect of the gesture. Patricia, who had finally made her way back to her seat, offered a tight, victorious smile. They were all participating in the public humiliation, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle of the wealthy, successful younger sister, taking pity on the struggling, bitter older sibling. I looked at the $100 bill floating in the air between us. I did not swat it away. I did not yell. I simply raised my hand and took the bill from her fingers. Brittany's smirk widened, assuming I had finally swallowed my pride and accepted my lower place in the family hierarchy. I held the bill up to the light of the crystal chandelier, inspecting it closely. I told Brittany it was a very generous gift. I then asked her if she happened to know the current daily interest rate on the $40,000 short-term loan she used to buy that Prada bag, because $100 would barely cover the late fees for a single day. The laughter in the room stopped instantly. It was as if someone had flipped a switch and sucked all the oxygen out of the space. Brittany's smug smile froze on her face. She looked at Jamal, panic flashing in her eyes. Jamal spilled a few drops of champagne onto the white tablecloth, his hand suddenly shaking. I did not give them a single second to recover their shattered composure. I turned away from Brittany, walked the final few steps to the end of the table, and placed my hands firmly on the top of my leather briefcase. I pushed the twin brass latches. They popped open with a loud, sharp click that echoed perfectly in the suddenly silent room. I flipped the leather lid back, exposing the thick, organized manila folders inside. I looked straight down the length of the long table, making deliberate, unblinking eye contact with every single extended family member who had just openly laughed at me. I told them to sit back and hold on to their expensive crystal drinks because the real presentation regarding Jamal's amazing generational wealth was finally about to begin right now. I firmly guaranteed every single one of them that it was not going to be funny at all for anybody. I reached into the open briefcase and slowly withdrew the 3 thick manila folders. I laid them out side by side on the mahogany table, making sure they were perfectly aligned. The bright overhead crystal chandelier illuminated the bold ink stamped across the top of the center folder. It was the official seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, sitting right next to the crisp blue logo of Chase Bank. The silence in the private dining room was absolute and suffocating. The clinking of silver forks against porcelain plates stopped completely. Uncle Richard squinted across the table, his forehead wrinkling as he tried to read the upside-down federal seals. The victorious, arrogant posture that Patricia had maintained all evening completely evaporated. She stared at the folders as if they were venomous snakes about to strike. I looked directly at Jamal. His face had lost all its color. "So, Jamal," I began, keeping my voice incredibly calm and measured. "You just told everyone in this room that you secured $500,000 in angel funding. You claimed investors were begging to partner with Apex Logistics Solutions. Since we are all family here and we are celebrating your massive financial genius, why do not you tell everyone the names of these incredible investors?" Jamal swallowed hard. The confident swagger that had radiated from him just 5 minutes ago was entirely gone. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning white. "You know I cannot do that, Vanessa," he stammered, his voice completely lacking its previous booming authority. "It is called a non-disclosure agreement. High-level corporate financing requires strict confidentiality. You would know that if you actually worked in venture capital instead of just looking at spreadsheets. A non-disclosure agreement." I repeated, letting a cold, mocking smile touch my lips. "That is fascinating, because usually venture capitalists want public credit for funding a successful tech startup. They want their names in press releases. They do not hide in the shadows." Jamal desperately tried to rally, looking toward my uncles for support. "This is a private equity deal," he insisted, though his voice cracked slightly on the last word. "We are keeping it quiet until the global product launch. It is standard industry practice." I reached forward and tapped my index finger sharply against the Chase Bank folder. "Private equity. Right. Well, my firm handles compliance for some of the largest private equity firms in Chicago, and I have never seen one operate out of a standard commercial loan division at a retail bank. Let us cut the garbage, Jamal. There are no angel investors. There is no private equity firm. Your $500,000 did not come from Silicon Valley." Brittany looked back and forth between her husband and me. The fake smile was completely gone from her face, replaced by genuine, mounting dread. She tugged at Jamal's velvet sleeve, whispering frantically and asking him what I was talking about. Jamal ignored her, keeping his panicked eyes locked entirely on my briefcase. Patricia suddenly slammed her hand flat on the table, desperate to regain control. "Vanessa, close that briefcase right now," she demanded, her voice shrill and trembling. "You are ruining a beautiful family dinner with your jealous lies." "I am not talking to you yet, Mother," I snapped, my voice cracking through the silent room like a literal whip. "Your turn is coming very soon. Sit down and stay completely quiet." Patricia actually flinched. The sheer authority in my tone caught her so off guard that she slumped backward into her chair, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. I turned my focus entirely back to my brother-in-law. "I asked you a direct question, Jamal. Where did the money come from? Because according to these federal wire transfer logs, the exact sum of $500,000 was deposited into your overdrawn corporate account this morning from a collateralized commercial loan. It was not an equity investment. It was a loan. A massive high-interest bank loan." Sweat began to bead along Jamal's hairline. The custom velvet dinner jacket suddenly looked like a straitjacket. He tugged at his silk collar, looking frantically toward the heavy oak doors, as if calculating whether he could simply run away. "It is a bridge loan," he whispered hoarsely, completely abandoning the angel investor lie. "It is just temporary financing to cover our expansion costs." Temporary financing. I echoed loudly, making sure every single relative heard me perfectly. Approved for a man who is currently defaulting on 3 different high-interest merchant cash advances. A man whose wife is driving a luxury vehicle that is actively scheduled for repossession tomorrow morning. Loud gasps echoed around the table. Uncle Richard dropped his napkin. My cousins started whispering frantically to each other. The illusion of Jamal the millionaire was shattering in real time, exposed in front of the exact audience he wanted to impress the most. "The banking system is deeply flawed, Jamal, but it is not completely stupid," I continued, stepping slightly closer to the table. "No bank on this planet would hand you $500,000 based on your catastrophic financial history. They would require a guarantor with an immaculate credit score, and they would require a massive piece of hard collateral." Jamal looked like he was about to physically be sick. He knew exactly what was inside those folders. The tension in the room was so thick it was hard to breathe. Everyone sat completely frozen, waiting for the final devastating blow to fall. I reached into the Chase Bank folder and pulled out a crisp, heavy stack of papers. I held up the first page, turning it slowly so that the official bank letterhead was clearly visible to everyone in the room. I kept my voice perfectly steady, projecting my words like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. "This is the final approval notice for the $500,000 commercial loan that Apex Logistics Solutions received this morning," I announced. "It is a fascinating document. It outlines the terms, the interest rate, and most importantly, the primary guarantor." I flipped to the third page and pointed to the bottom right corner. Right here, next to the highlighted signature line, is my printed name, my personal social security number, and what is supposed to be my signature. It explicitly states that I am legally responsible for this entire massive debt. Uncle Richard leaned forward, pushing his plate of Wagyu beef away. The amusement was completely gone from his face, replaced by a deep, uncomfortable frown. He looked across the table at Jamal and asked him if he had actually forced me to co-sign a loan for his business. Jamal wiped a thick bead of sweat from his forehead using his expensive silk napkin. He stuttered desperately, trying to play it off to the family. He claimed that we had come to a mutual family agreement to help him scale the company, insisting it was just a temporary bridge loan. I slammed my hand flat onto the mahogany table. The sharp smack made Brittany jump visibly in her seat. "There was no mutual agreement," I stated coldly. "I explicitly told you and my mother that I would never attach my credit to your fraudulent shell company. I kicked you out of my apartment when you tried to physically intimidate me into signing these exact papers. So my mother decided to steal my confidential tax documents from my desk and forge my signature herself." Loud gasps erupted around the dining room. Several of my cousins covered their mouths in absolute shock. Patricia turned entirely pale, her jaw clenching as the extended family turned their collective gaze toward her. I moved my hand to the second folder, the one prominently stamped with the Department of Justice seal. I pulled out a series of printed emails and federal monitoring logs. When I received the automated email alert that this loan had been approved, I could have just called the fraud department and canceled it. But I knew you would just lie your way out of it. You would claim it was a misunderstanding. So I called a former colleague of mine, Special Agent David Reynolds, at the FBI White Collar Crime Division. Jamal physically recoiled, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He looked frantically toward the heavy oak doors, his chest heaving under his velvet dinner jacket. "I told the FBI to let the wire transfer go through," I explained thoroughly, enjoying the absolute horror washing over my brother-in-law's face. "The moment that $500,000 crossed digital state lines and landed in your corporate bank account, this stopped being a simple case of family identity theft. It instantly became federal wire fraud. The FBI has been tracking the money all day long." Jamal tried to stand up, his voice cracking as he yelled that he had already moved the money to a secure holding account. He insisted the business was fully legitimate and I had no right to interfere with his corporate operations. I laughed out loud, a harsh, unforgiving sound. No, you did not, Jamal. You are not nearly smart enough to hide federal funds. You tried to wire $50,000 to your aggressive merchant cash advance lenders this afternoon to stop them from repossessing your wife's luxury car. But the transfer bounced. I looked down at my watch, then back up at his terrified face. At exactly 2 o'clock this afternoon, the federal government placed a hard freeze on every single bank account attached to your Social Security number and your employer identification number. You cannot withdraw cash. You cannot wire funds. You cannot even buy a cup of coffee right now. The money is entirely locked down. You are completely, utterly penniless. Brittany let out a piercing shriek. She grabbed her phone from the table and frantically opened her mobile banking application. Her perfectly manicured fingers tapped wildly against the screen. A second later, she dropped the phone onto her porcelain dinner plate with a loud clatter. She looked at Jamal, tears of genuine panic streaming down her face, screaming that her personal checking accounts were showing a negative balance and a federal lock code. I leaned across the table, locking eyes with Jamal. You threw this massive celebration to brag about your incredible business acumen. You ordered caviar and vintage champagne. But you do not have a single dime to your name. When the waiter brings the bill tonight, your cards will decline. The silence in the room was completely shattered by Jamal letting out a ragged, desperate gasp. He stared at his phone, his thumb swiping wildly across the banking application, refreshing the screen over and over again in a futile attempt to make the negative balances disappear. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was finally looking down. Brittany was openly weeping now, her mascara running down her cheeks, smudging her flawless makeup. She slapped Jamal on the chest, demanding he do something. Demanding he call his imaginary investors to fix this massive disaster immediately. But Jamal was paralyzed. He had absolutely nothing left to say. That was when Patricia decided to take matters into her own hands. She pushed her chair back so violently that it tipped over and crashed loudly onto the floor. She marched around the mahogany table, completely ignoring the horrified stares of her own siblings. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. She stomped right up to my end of the table, slamming her palms down onto the wood, leaning across the folders, as if she wanted to physically reach over and strangle me. "You think you are so smart, Vanessa!" Patricia screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the velvet walls of the private dining room. You think you have won because you made a few phone calls to the FBI. You think freezing Jamal out is going to destroy him, but you are completely forgetting one massive, crucial detail. I did not flinch. I kept my hands folded neatly over the leather handle of my briefcase. I asked her what exactly she thought I was forgetting. Patricia let out a harsh, manic laugh that made several of my cousins physically recoil in their seats. "You are forgetting where the collateral came from," she yelled, pointing a trembling finger right in my face. "It does not matter if the bank accounts are frozen right now. It does not matter if you refuse to cooperate with us. I pledged your grandmother's house to secure that loan. The bank holds the lien. If Jamal cannot access those funds to make the monthly payments, Chase Bank will simply foreclose on the property." A collective gasp rippled through the extended family. Uncle Richard stood up, his face flushed with absolute outrage. He demanded to know if Patricia had actually leveraged their mother's only home to fund a fake tech company. Patricia did not even look at him. She kept her crazed, furious eyes locked entirely on me, completely indifferent to the disgust radiating from her own family members. She owned the horrific betrayal. She actively weaponized it. "That is exactly right," Patricia shouted proudly, her chest heaving with exertion. Beatrice signed the power of attorney. "It is a legally binding pledge. So go ahead, Vanessa. Keep the accounts frozen. Refuse to drop the wire fraud charges. Let the bank declare the loan in default today. They will seize that brick bungalow by the end of the month, and I will gladly stand on the sidewalk and watch them throw my own mother out onto the street." The sheer depravity of her threat hung heavily in the air. She was openly admitting to sacrificing an elderly, frail woman just to maintain her twisted sense of control. She was threatening to render her own mother completely homeless just to spite me. The entire dining room felt suffocatingly tight, as if the oxygen had been completely sucked out. You are going to call your little FBI friend right now, Patricia commanded, her voice dropping to a menacing guttural growl. You are going to tell them you made a mistake. You will unfreeze Jamal's accounts. You will drop this ridiculous investigation, and you will walk out of this restaurant immediately. If you do not do exactly what I say, Beatrice loses everything she has ever worked for, and it will be entirely your fault. I looked around the room. Uncle Richard was pulling out his phone, likely preparing to call Beatrice or a lawyer. My aunts were crying silently, utterly devastated by the monster their sister had become. Brittany had stopped crying and was now looking at our mother with a sick, desperate glimmer of hope, actually believing that this horrific blackmail was going to save her luxury lifestyle. I turned my attention back to Patricia. Her eyes were wild-dilated with the desperate adrenaline of a cornered animal. She truly believed she had checkmated me. She thought she had found the one emotional pressure point that would force me to surrender completely. She thought my love for my grandmother was a weakness she could easily exploit. I slowly shook my head once. I looked at Patricia with nothing but cold clinical detachment. You really think you hold all the cards? I said softly. My voice was no longer a shout. It was barely above a whisper, but it carried perfectly across the dead silence of the private dining room. You stand there bragging about blackmailing your own mother, completely convinced that your forged power of attorney makes you invincible. Patricia sneered, slamming her hand flat against the table again. It is a legal document, Vanessa. The bank accepted it. You cannot undo a collateralized pledge just because you are throwing a childish tantrum. Call the FBI and cancel the investigation, or Beatrice loses the house. It is that simple. I reached past the Chase Bank folder and the Department of Justice folder. I placed my hand on the third and final manila folder sitting on the mahogany table. This one did not have a bank logo or a federal seal. It had the embossed gold stamp of one of the most prestigious estate planning law firms in the entire state of Illinois. I flipped the folder open and pulled out a thick stack of heavy watermarked parchment paper. The top document was an original notarized property deed adorned with blue ribbons and a raised county clerk seal. I slid the document across the polished wood, pushing it directly in front of Patricia. I told her she was absolutely right about one thing. A bank will absolutely accept a signed power of attorney to secure a commercial loan. Automated underwriting systems do not double-check every single signature before funding. They blindly assume the person submitting the paperwork actually has the legal right to pledge the asset. But that assumption only works if the person signing the legal document actually owns the property. Patricia looked down at the heavy parchment. Her eyes darted rapidly across the dense legal text. I could see the exact second her brain hit a brick wall of comprehension. She squinted, her lips parting, as she read the names listed on the official deed. Let me take you on a little trip down memory lane. Mother, I announced, projecting my voice, so the entire family could hear the final nail being hammered into her coffin. 5 years ago, right after Grandpa Theodore passed away, you started hanging around Beatrice a lot more than usual. You brought over that shady strip mall lawyer, desperately trying to convince her to put the brick bungalow into a joint tenancy. You wanted your name on the deed so you could borrow against the equity whenever you felt like it. Uncle Richard let out a loud, disgusted groan, shaking his head at Patricia. Several aunts muttered under their breath. They were finally seeing the exact depths of her limitless greed. When I caught you trying to trick her back, then I knew exactly what you were planning. I continued, my voice hardening into absolute steel. I knew Jamal was already draining Brittany dry, and I knew it was only a matter of time before you decided to sacrifice Beatrice to fund this pathetic illusion of high society wealth. So a month after you tried to steal her house the first time, I took Beatrice to my firm's senior legal counsel downtown. Patricia's hands began to shake violently. She picked up the deed, staring at the bold black letters as if they were written in a foreign language. We executed an irrevocable trust, I stated, dropping the heaviest legal hammer possible directly onto her head. Beatrice legally transferred the entire deed of that house out of her personal name and placed it entirely into the trust. She surrendered legal ownership in exchange for a lifetime right of residency, and she named me as the sole trustee and the ultimate beneficiary. The color drained completely from Patricia's face. She dropped the heavy parchment paper back onto the table as if it had physically burned her fingers. She stumbled backward, bumping into her overturned dining chair. "Do you understand what that means?" I asked, leaning forward over the table, refusing to give her a single inch to breathe. "It means when you went to the hospital 3 months ago and tricked an elderly, heavily medicated woman into signing a power of attorney, you had her sign over control of absolutely nothing. Beatrice did not own the house. She could not pledge it as collateral, and therefore you could not pledge it either." Patricia opened her mouth to scream, to deny it, to fight back, but her vocal cords completely failed her. She was choking on her own catastrophic hubris. "That house belongs to a legally bulletproof trust," I declared, my voice echoing with total, undeniable victory. "The bank cannot foreclose on it. The government cannot seize it. It is completely untouchable. Your trump card is completely worthless." Patricia stood frozen, her eyes wide with a terror that finally matched the severity of her crimes. She looked at the property deed on the mahogany table, then back at me, her chest heaving rapidly as she struggled to draw a full breath. The absolute certainty in my voice had completely shattered her reality. She was no longer the arrogant matriarch dictating terms to her disobedient daughter. She was a trapped criminal staring directly at the consequences of her own boundless greed. "Let me break down exactly what the law says about what you did today," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the thick silence of the private dining room. "When you sat in that commercial bank office and signed the loan documents, you signed a legally binding federal affidavit. You swore under penalty of perjury that you possessed the right to pledge that residential property as collateral. You used a medical power of attorney that was null and void the very second the ink dried on this trust 5 years ago. You deliberately lied to a federally insured banking institution about the ownership of a major asset to secure a massive financial payout." I took a slow step forward, keeping my eyes locked on Patricia's pale face. "Under federal law, that is not a simple family misunderstanding. That is not a civil dispute that can be negotiated away behind closed doors. That is the textbook definition of mortgage fraud. And because you utilize the United States banking system to process the fraudulent collateral pledge, you automatically triggered federal bank fraud statutes. The penalty for intentionally defrauding a federally insured financial institution is up to 30 years in federal prison and a financial penalty of up to $1 million. Patricia let out a quiet, strangled gasp, her hands gripping the edges of the table to keep herself from completely collapsing onto the floor. But I was not finished. "But you did not stop there, did you, Mother?" I continued, my tone clinical and completely devoid of any sympathy. "You needed a guarantor with a flawless credit score to push the approval through the automated underwriting system. You knew your credit was insufficient, and you knew Jamal was a walking financial disaster. So you stole my personal tax documents from my apartment. You stole my social security number. You forged my signature on a massive guarantor application. In the eyes of the law, that is aggravated identity theft. That specific charge carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 2 additional years in federal prison, and those years must be served consecutively on top of whatever sentence you receive for the bank fraud." I turned my attention away from my mother and looked directly at Jamal. He was sitting completely still, his head buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent panic. The expensive velvet dinner jacket now looked utterly ridiculous on a man who was about to lose his freedom. "And you, Jamal," I said loudly, making sure he heard every single syllable. "You are the sole beneficiary of this massive criminal conspiracy. The $500,000 was wired directly into a corporate bank account registered exclusively to your name and your employer identification number. You were fully aware that you did not legally qualify for that massive loan. You knew the collateral was secured illegally by your mother-in-law, and you knew my signature was completely forged on the guarantor paperwork. You are an active co-conspirator to federal wire fraud." I paced slowly behind my chair, addressing the entire room now. "Right now, Chase Bank believes they have a fully secured commercial loan. But tomorrow morning, when the FBI delivers a certified copy of this property deed to the bank's Central Fraud Division, the underwriting department will immediately realize their $500,000 loan is entirely unsecured. They will realize they just handed a fortune to a man with active merchant cash, advanced defaults, and zero legitimate business revenue. They will instantly demand the full repayment of the principal balance. But as we established earlier tonight, the money is already frozen by the federal government. You cannot pay it back. Uncle Richard finally spoke up, his voice trembling with a mixture of intense anger and profound disgust. He looked at Patricia and told her she was an absolute disgrace to their parents' memory. He announced to the room that he would personally hire a top-tier attorney tomorrow morning to ensure Beatrice was permanently protected from any further harassment. He then looked Jamal dead in the eye and stated he would not spend a single dime of family money to help either of them fight the federal indictments. My aunts nodded in quiet, solemn agreement. The high society family that Patricia had so desperately wanted to impress had completely turned against her. Brittany let out a loud, pathetic wail. She looked at Patricia and screamed, asking her how she could be so incredibly stupid. Brittany was not crying for Beatrice. She was not crying for the betrayal of her sister. She was crying because her luxury lifestyle was officially dead. She knew her Prada bags, her designer shoes, and her white Range Rover were going to be seized by the aggressive creditors. She knew she was going to lose the country club memberships she had bragged about for months. I looked at the three of them, feeling an overwhelming sense of closure. The decades of emotional abuse, the constant psychological gaslighting, the blatant favoritism, it had all culminated in this single spectacular collapse. They had built their entire identities on a fragile foundation of lies, and I had simply provided the legal earthquake required to shatter it completely. The reality of the situation crashed down upon Jamal and Patricia with the crushing weight of a falling building. The heavy silence in the private dining room was broken only by Brittany weeping softly into her hands. Jamal looked at the forged bank documents sitting on the table, then looked at Patricia. His expression shifted rapidly from pure terror to a desperate, self-serving rage. He realized that if he went down for federal wire fraud, he would lose the next decade of his life behind bars. He needed a scapegoat, and the woman who actually forged the signature was sitting right next to him. "You told me it was handled!" Jamal screamed, his voice cracking violently as he pointed a shaking finger at Patricia. He backed away from her, physically distancing himself as if she carried a contagious disease. "You told me the collateral was perfectly legal. You told me Vanessa had agreed to co-sign the documents. I had absolutely no idea you stole her identity. I did not forge anything. I just signed the corporate paperwork. You are the one who committed identity theft. You are the one who committed mortgage fraud. You lied to the bank, and you lied to me to cover your own tracks." Patricia snapped her head toward him, her eyes wide with betrayed fury. She could not believe the golden son-in-law she had just sacrificed her own mother for was throwing her directly under the bus. She lunged forward, slapping Jamal away with a sharp crack that echoed across the room. "Do not you dare play the innocent victim with me!" Patricia shrieked, her voice turning incredibly shrill. "You came to my house crying like a pathetic child. You begged me for help. You told me the loan sharks were going to break your legs if you did not pay them back by Friday morning. I risked absolutely everything to save your miserable life. You knew exactly where those documents came from. You watched me take the file. You happily took the stolen money. You are just a pathetic fraud who could not provide for my daughter without stealing from your own family." The two of them stood at the head of the ruined banquet table, screaming vicious accusations at each other. They were tearing each other apart completely, shedding their polished high society masks to reveal the selfish, desperate criminals hiding underneath. Uncle Richard stood up and physically ushered my aunts and cousins toward the far wall, creating a wide berth between the innocent family members and the two collapsing felons. Brittany remained frozen in her chair, staring blankly at the fighting pair, completely incapable of processing the absolute destruction of her marriage and her mother. I remained standing at the opposite end of the table, calmly watching the implosion. I did not need to say another word. They were doing my job for me. Then the ambient lighting of the private dining room suddenly shifted. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn back slightly, exposing the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that faced the busy Chicago street. A bright pulsing glow suddenly cut through the darkness outside. Vivid flashes of red and blue light bounced off the crystal chandeliers and illuminated the terrified faces of everyone in the room. Jamal stopped screaming mid-sentence. He slowly turned his head toward the window. The color completely drained from his face as the rhythmic strobing of the police cruisers painted the room in alternating colors of panic. Patricia froze her chest, heaving her eyes, darting frantically toward the restaurant entrance. The chaotic street noise outside was suddenly pierced by the short, authoritative chirp of a police siren signaling that multiple vehicles had completely blocked the main entrance. The heavy oak doors of the private dining room did not just swing open, they were pushed open with forceful, tactical precision. The restaurant manager stepped aside, his face pale and terrified. Behind him, a team of 6 men and women in dark windbreakers stepped into the room. The yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation were printed on their jackets. They moved with absolute authority, fanning out quickly to secure the exits. Special Agent David Reynolds walked in last. He was an imposing man with a no-nonsense demeanor. He held a thick leather folder in his hand. His eyes swept across the room, taking in the terrified family members huddled against the wall, the lavish feast sitting untouched on the mahogany table, and finally, the 2 sweating suspects standing at the head of the room. David made brief eye contact with me and offered a barely perceptible nod of confirmation. He then turned his attention toward Jamal and Patricia, pulling out 2 federal arrest warrants from his thick leather folder. Jamal Davis and Patricia Miller. Special Agent Reynolds announced, his voice carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of federal authority. He did not yell, but the absolute command in his tone immediately silenced the remaining whispers in the room. He stepped up to the head of the mahogany table holding the 2 arrest warrants, so that both of them could clearly see the federal seals stamped at the top. I am Special Agent Reynolds with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We are executing a federal warrant for your immediate arrest. Jamal stumbled backward until the back of his knees hit his overturned dining chair. He raised his hands in a frantic defensive gesture, shaking his head violently from side to side. Wait, please! Jamal begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine that sounded nothing like the booming entrepreneur from just 10 minutes ago. This is a huge misunderstanding. I did not do this. She did it. My mother-in-law forged the papers. I just signed the corporate forms. I am a victim here. Agent Reynolds was completely unmoved by the pathetic display. He gestured to 2 of the armed agents standing right behind him. They stepped forward instantly, grabbing Jamal by the arms and spinning him around to face the velvet wall. Jamal Davis, you are being charged with 1 count of conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud, Reynolds stated, reciting the severe charges with clinical precision. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around Jamal's wrists echoed loudly in the silent room. The sound completely broke him. The man who had just stood at the head of the table bragging about building a multi-million-dollar empire began to openly sob. Tears streamed down his face, dropping onto the silk lapels of his expensive velvet dinner jacket. He cried like a terrified child, his knees buckling so heavily that the 2 federal agents literally had to hold him up by his armpits to keep him from collapsing onto the floor. Patricia, however, did not cry. Her reaction was a manifestation of the exact same arrogant entitlement that had fueled her entire life. When a female agent approached her with an open pair of handcuffs, she actually slapped the agent's hand away. "Do not touch me," Patricia hissed, her eyes wide with burning indignation. "I am a respectable woman. I am a mother. I am not going to be treated like a common criminal over a simple family dispute. I demand to speak to my lawyer immediately." The agent did not hesitate or entertain her demands. She grabbed Patricia's wrist with a practiced, unyielding grip, twisting her arm firmly behind her back. Patricia gasped in genuine pain and shock as the cold steel snapped tightly shut around her wrists. "Patricia Miller!" Agent Reynolds continued, raising his voice slightly to talk over her indignant gasps. "You are being charged with aggravated identity theft, mortgage fraud, and federal bank fraud. You have the right to remain silent, which I highly suggest you begin exercising right now." The absolute humiliation of the moment finally washed over her completely. She was standing in handcuffs in the middle of a Michelin star restaurant, surrounded by the extended family she had spent her entire life trying to impress. Uncle Richard and her sisters watched her with undisguised disgust. There was absolutely no sympathy in their eyes. There was only the harsh realization that she was exactly the monster I had just exposed her to be. As the agents began to pull Jamal and Patricia toward the heavy oak doors, Brittany finally snapped out of her paralyzed state. She stumbled across the room, her designer heels clicking frantically against the hardwood floor. She did not run to her husband or her mother. She ran directly to me. Brittany grabbed my forearms, her fingers digging painfully into my silk blouse. Her perfectly contoured face was a messy, tear-streaked disaster. "Vanessa, please!" Brittany wailed, her voice thick with panic and sheer desperation. "Please stop them. You cannot let them do this. Jamal is my husband. He provides for me. If he goes to prison, I will lose my house. I will lose the car. I will have absolutely nothing. You have to tell the FBI it was a joke. You have to tell them you gave Mom permission. Please, Vanessa, we are sisters. We are family." I looked down at the hands gripping my arms. I did not shove her away. I simply reached up and peeled her fingers off my sleeves one by one, stepping back to break the physical contact. I looked at her with absolutely zero pity. "You did not care about being sisters when you were popping champagne on a yacht in Miami while I was lying in a hospital bed hooked up to heart monitors." I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of emotion. "You did not care about family when you tried to humiliate me with a $100 bill 10 minutes ago. You built your entire life on stolen money and lies, Brittany. Now the bill is due." I picked up my leather briefcase from the table and snapped the brass latches shut. I looked past Brittany to where Jamal and Patricia were being marched out the door by the federal agents. I raised my voice just enough so they would both hear my final words before the doors closed. "Enjoy your stress-free, drama-free vacation in federal prison." The heavy oak doors swung shut, cutting off the sound of my mother's outrage and my brother-in-law's pathetic apologies forever. It has been exactly 1 year since that night at the Michelin star restaurant. Today, the only heavy doors I walk through belong to my own commercial office suite in downtown Chicago. After the FBI investigation concluded, my reputation in the financial sector skyrocketed. The managing partners at my former agency were stunned by how meticulously I had documented the fraud, but I did not stay there to accept their corporate promotions. I left the agency and opened my own independent forensic accounting firm. I now have a dedicated team of junior auditors working under me. We specialize in tracing hidden assets in complex fraud cases, helping victims of financial abuse reclaim their stolen lives. Every time I look at the brass nameplate on my office door, I am reminded that true success is built on absolute integrity, not cheap illusions. More importantly, Grandma Beatrice is safe, happy, and entirely at peace. I am sitting with her right now on the back porch of her beautiful brick bungalow, drinking iced tea and watching her tend to her beloved rose bushes. The paralyzing fear that once clouded her eyes is completely gone. The house remains legally bulletproof within the trust, and her home is now filled only with people who genuinely love and respect her. Uncle Richard steps in frequently to help with the heavy lifting around the yard, and my aunts visit every Sunday for dinner. We formed a new, beautiful family unit, one entirely free from the toxic manipulation that used to poison every single holiday gathering. As for the people who tried to destroy us, the federal justice system was not nearly as forgiving as our family used to be. Patricia was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison for aggravated identity theft and bank fraud. Jamal received 8 years for wire fraud conspiracy, a sentence significantly aggravated by his numerous predatory loan defaults. Their mugshots completely stripped away their polished high society facades. And Brittany, the sister who once threw a $100 bill at me as a cruel joke, was left completely bankrupt. The aggressive creditors seized her white Range Rover, her designer bags, and her rented luxury home within days of Jamal being incarcerated. The last I heard, she was working double shifts as a waitress at a suburban diner just to afford a tiny studio apartment, still complaining to anyone who will listen about how unfair the world is to her. I blocked her number the morning after the arrests and never looked back. People often tell you that family is everything, that blood is thicker than water, and that you have to forgive your relatives no matter what they do to you. That is a dangerous, toxic lie. Blood simply means you share genetic markers. It does not give anyone a free pass to exploit your hard work, steal your identity, or use your life as collateral for their own selfish greed. For over 3 decades, I allowed myself to be the family scapegoat because I thought endurance was a form of love. I thought if I just worked harder, achieved more, and stayed quiet, they would eventually respect me. I learned the hard way that toxic people do not respect boundaries, they only respect consequences. Walking away from your own mother and sister is the hardest decision you will ever make. It goes against everything society conditions us to believe. But sometimes cutting off a toxic bloodline is the absolute only way to save your own life. You are allowed to create your own chosen family. You are allowed to protect your peace, your finances, and your mental health with absolute ferocity. Family should be a sanctuary, not a financial trap. If someone brings nothing but chaos, lies, and destruction into your life, you owe them absolutely nothing, no matter what their title is on a birth certificate. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Have you ever had to draw a hard line and walk away from a toxic family member to protect yourself? How did you finally break free from their emotional manipulation? I would absolutely love to hear your personal stories in the comments below. Reading your experiences reminds me that none of us are ever truly alone in this fight for boundaries and self-respect. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more authentic stories of resilience, justice, and taking back your power. Share this video with someone who might need the courage to stand up to the bullies in their own family. Remember, your worth is never defined by how toxic people treat you, and your future is entirely yours to protect. I will see you in the next video.